Welcome to the AA Podcast, our little corner of the web where we are not afraid to discuss tough questions like,
when did nutrition, health, movement, and stress management become alternative medicine?
Where we embrace challenges in all aspects of life to become healthier and stronger versions of ourselves.
And where food and movement are the best kinds of medicine, and cooking meals at home is a revolutionary act.
Welcome back to the third episode of the AA Podcast. We are Ashley Olson
and Andrea Crane.
And today we are continuing our series on autoimmunity. So if you are just now joining in and haven't listened to part one, I highly recommend you do that before continuing. But we're going to just kind of do a high-level overview of what we talked about last time and get right into things. So before we do that, though, we have our Bible verse that we are going to share with each other. So each week, or each episode, each week, we are going to surprise each other with the Bible verse that came to mind or that we just found to be meaningful for us individually. So mine is Psalms 30, verse 5. This is going to be the second part of the verse, and it is, weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning.
Oh my gosh. They just read that Psalms at church.
Oh,
Sunday.
That's awesome.
Oh, that's crazy. Okay. So mine is, I get a little darker than you do. This is James 1:2. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. And this is particularly meaningful because, especially in light of autoimmunity, people really suffer. And I absolutely can speak to this from personal experience. And so I know about the suffering, and it's also frustrating to know that it's like a betrayal on a cellular level, if that makes sense, right? Like your own body is betraying you and attacking you, and it's incredibly frustrating, and the suffering is real. So anyway, that was particularly poignant. So
I love it.
All right.
So good.
So I think today we're gonna begin. Okay, first of all, I just want to say it is like 110% humidity. So basically we're underwater here in Idaho today. And I am sweating like a man. So is there sorry.
I think that's an autoimmune issue.
Hyperhidrosis. Yes. No, I am having some issues. I'm like dripping. So can you hear my little tiny fan, my little desktop fan? Is there a hum that is
I don't hear one, so I think we're okay.
Oh, that's fantastic. Okay.
Yeah. And if you might hear a squeaker here or there, my dog is in the other room.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She was on the desk earlier, so
I know.
At least she's in the other room now.
Little fuzzball up on the desk, and I was like, no way is that puppy up in front of the camera. She was. Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna, let's see, we'll just recap the three-legged stool of autoimmunity. So these are the three conditions that have to be physiologically met in order for autoimmunity to develop. So,
and just a recap too, autoimmunity basic definition is an attack of the body, right?
Right. It is the body creating antibodies against its own tissue. And I elaborated a lot more on that definition in the previous episode, which was pretty quick. It was a quick 30-minute episode. So make sure you go back and listen to that if you haven't already. And we are continuing on today with just that quick little reintroduction into this three-legged stool, but we'll also talk about what we can do about these things that have to be met. So the first one is genetics, and we can't do anything about that. at this time, we are unable to go back and rewrite our genetics. So, for those of us that hit the genetic lottery just right and got all kinds of autoimmunity handed down, that is fantastic. However, as we talked about last time, your genetics are not your destiny, and they don't have to express. So there's this idea of a genotype, or what's in your genes, and then there's the phenotypic expression of those genes. And so you may have the genotype, but you don't necessarily have to express the phenotype, or the disease itself doesn't have to manifest. So I guess said another way, you have the blueprints for the disease, but you don't have to build the house. Does that make sense?
Love it. Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
So number 2 is there has to be exposure, and primarily this is some kind of ongoing exposure or long-term exposure. By far, the most common exposure that we run into is that of food. And so uh, you've probably heard the term familiarity breeds contempt. So that's a little saying that the more you see something, the more you see someone, the more you see some circumstance or condition, that familiarity breeds a contemptuous feelings. Well, the immune system kind of works on the same principle. So the more often that we are exposed to something, the more contemptuous our immune system gets. And so it kind of gets all riled up. It will see something, gosh, let's say it will see something every day for 7, 10, 15 years. And along during the course of that time, it's just getting more and more upset. And so finally, it's had enough, and it has seen too much of that one exposure. And then it finally breaks and just starts creating antibodies towards that one thing. So we'll get into that a little bit more in that mechanism here as we go along. But suffice it to say, exposure, the environmental exposure. Now, it could also be something like chemicals. If you have to work around a lot of chemicals, if you work in a moldy building and you are really susceptible to things like mold, then it's a bit of an easier proposition to get you out of that circumstance or do things to mitigate. But food is a really hard one. So if it comes down to a food exposure, then we really need to revamp your diet.
Would you say primarily who you see, is there like a percentage that you could comfortably spout that, like, 50%, 60% of the people you see is food?
I would say it's probably 90 to 95% of people with autoimmunity, if not higher.
Okay.
We can get traction based on governing food exposure very carefully.
Okay.
Yeah.
So food is
critical, huge. And because we can't stop eating, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that we tend to do, again, back to this concept of familiarity, what we tend to do is eat the same things every single day. We are not taught as a society, as a culture, we're not taught to vary our diets at all. And in fact, back, I don't know, 50, 70 years ago, and before, we only had access to those things that were in season. And so we ate seasonally, right? Like our diets necessarily had to change. But now, with the advent of all of this packaged food, we open boxes, and those boxes are available to us year round. And so the same thing is true for produce. So for those of us that do actually eat some produce and eat, a fairly healthy plant diet, you eat the same things year round because they have availability now. I mean, you can literally get I won't say melons, but you can literally get like the apples, oranges, bananas year round.
Oh yeah.
Because they come from all over the world. And so, yeah, we are eating the same thing day after day after day after day. And this just there are specific foods that we can pin down that are more immunogenic than others, meaning that they kind of poke the immune system in the eye, and the immune system says, "Okay, you want to fight? We'll
Yeah.
fight. I'm going
All
to
right.
create some antibodies, and we will go to it." Um, and then third, there is this concept of leaky gut.
Mm.
Um, and again, this term has been a little bit bastardized in the culture. Um, but I but clinically we call it intestinal permeability. It is a real thing. And just we talked about Dr. Vojdani and his work, published, gosh, going on 10 years ago, that this is one of the conditions that has to be met in order for autoimmunity to manifest. And so, one of the things that, well, do you have questions about intestinal permeability? Is there anything that I should explain further with that?
Well, I guess with my clients, it's
Mm-hmm.
pretty common that most clients have been told by their doctor they have um, um, IBS or leaky gut or something like that.
Okay.
Now, are those in that same IP?
No. So they often will find themselves in the same patient. However, um, I think there's a lot of clinicians these days kind of throwing these words around without a lot of maybe understanding of the underlying physiology of this.
Okay.
So, okay, so here's let's just do a quick primer on leaky gut or intestinal permeability. So when we eat food, actually, let's start with just the digestive tract. So basically, we're talking about a tube that runs all the way from the mouth to the anus, and it is a tube. And so you can think about it as just kind of like a human being hollow in the middle. We've literally got a tube, like a long john, that runs that runs down the middle of us. And so that what is inside the tube, and I always find this really fascinating, but what is inside the tube is considered to be external to us, just like the air, just like the environment we're walking around in. What is outside of that tube is considered to be internal. That is us. But what's inside the tube, that is an external environment. Okay. So we need, because the food that we eat um, automatically has proteins on the surface of the cells, right? We're eating cells. They're plant cells, they're wheat cells, they are animal cells, they're, everything that we eat, unless it's pure fat, has a little bit of protein on the surface of the cells. Okay. So, proteins are what get your immune system going. The immune system trades on a currency of protein. So, it that's how it recognizes things that are not self or that are self. Okay. So, proteins are made of amino acid building blocks. Now, once you take a protein and you rip it apart into those little amino acid building blocks, the immune system can no longer tell that that is from a foreign protein. Okay. So when we put, let's just talk a piece of steak first. All right. So we take a piece of steak, we eat it, it goes down into your stomach. It hits 2 molar hydrochloric acid. This is like eat your face off acid. And so it will begin that protein digestion. And it will take the proteins and it will start to tear it apart into individual amino acids. Now, then it hits the first portion of the small intestine called the duodenum, and proteases secreted by pancreas. Anyway, we're getting far into the weeds here, sorry. But
getting real
I know.
sciencey
I
on us.
know. Oh no. Okay. So anyway, stuff is secreted that rips it apart even more. However, in a person with leaky gut, they don't have the barrier function in their intestine. So when that food hits the duodenum, it's the walls of the duodenum, again, remember that tube is considered outside. And so that steak is still in a fairly whole, it's still fairly whole. Those proteins are still whole. It's not completely digested into its individual amino acids. And so things can then go across a leaky barrier. Does that make sense? So
Totally.
for somebody that's got intestinal permeability or leaky gut, their duodenum, it basically has holes in it. Now, it's more complex than that, and if people have questions, I'm very happy to go into that even more. But that's kind of what's going on, is that the barrier, the integrity of the barrier is not there, and so whole pieces of protein can get across. And then the immune system says, "Oh, wait a second. That's a whole protein, and that does not belong to us. So we're going to start fighting against that."
Mm.
Okay. So if I can reinitiate the integrity of that barrier, if I can snap those walls back together, then I can keep the whole proteins from getting across that barrier and from our immune system seeing it, right? The immune system is right outside of your gut, and it has to be, because those are your defenses. Like that's the walls into your kingdom, right? It has to be there, and it has to protect you against things like bacteria. If bacteria come across, they can infect you, they can cause sepsis, they can cause bloodborne infections that can kill you. And so we've got a ton of immune system tissue and cells that just kind of hang out outside the intestines in case something comes across. And it's not supposed to, but there's so many of us walking around with leaky guts that our immune systems are constantly stimulated. Okay.
So I guess my question too is if the body, the duodenum,
Okay. Yep.
Is not breaking down those proteins, is anything
Right.
being absorbed, or does it go?
That's a great question. So there are absorption mechanisms also. So you've brought up a great point, because I mean, eventually we have to get something across there or we don't get fed, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise the food goes out looking like it went in, which is true of corn and other things. But we have to absorb things in order for our body to be able to use it. However, that should not happen in the upper regions of the small intestine. And as well, it should not happen that those whole proteins get absorbed across. They should be broken into their individual amino acids as the protein travels the length of the small intestine.
Okay.
Which is many feet long.
For
Yeah.
sure.
So there's absorption that's happening all the way down the length of the small intestine. But ideally it's absorption of individual amino acids that are, broken apart. So the protein is not whole anymore.
Okay.
Okay. Now I guess what we should talk about is one thing that so people have probably heard, they're probably sick to death of hearing about gluten. But I have to bring it up because that is the absolute first thing that I do. Anybody that's got autoimmunity is I take them off of gluten. And yeah, go ahead.
Well, and we talked about this prior, like just our conversation, but it has to be complete gluten free. Can't
Thank you.
be. It cannot be. Well, I'm mostly gluten free.
Yeah.
And there are so many things that you have to watch out for nowadays, especially with processed packaged stuff that have gluten hidden in them. It may not even say that it has gluten. Like, there's sometimes warning labels, but can't there be like other ingredients that may have trace gluten?
So here is the good thing. Labeling within the last few years has really tightened up on common allergens like dairy, like gluten. If something contains gluten, it must say on the label. Now, the problem, I say problem, it's not so much a problem, but food manufacturers, in order to kind of cover their bases, a lot of times they will say processed in a facility where gluten is around, and so this may contain traces of gluten. For someone who is dealing with autoimmunity, it would be better if they would stay away from those items, and that is going to feel very much like it's everything that they eat. But here's the deal. When someone is sick, their autoimmunity is flaring, they have intestinal permeability, a nanomolar exposure to gluten, which is just nothing. I mean, it's a whisper, it's a vapor of gluten. That can take up to 2 years to heal the damage done by that micro exposure.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
And
significant.
it is. And this is what is not impressed upon people. So there's plenty of people out there taking their patients off of gluten. They'll say, hey, just try it. Try a gluten-free diet, because it's life-changing for a lot of people. And so it's low-hanging fruit. It's something actionable. And so they say, yeah, just try it. Be gluten-free. Well, the problem is they don't impress upon their patients, that these micro exposures, they matter. They matter. You have to be 100%. You have to be perfect.
Because most of the people that you're seeing, they're not 16-year-olds. They're
Right.
35, 40s, 50s, and they're
60s. Yeah.
and they're finally realizing, oh, I have felt like crap for this many years. And so the recovery process is not going to just be a 2-week, 4-week, not even probably 6-month ordeal. What kind of time frame is average, would you say, and can people eventually ever go back on gluten, or is this something that has to be eliminated for good?
Well, okay. So here is where I probably diverge a little bit from others in the industry. And I mean lovingly the functional medicine industry. Um, I think that if autoimmunity is caught early enough, if it is dealt with early enough, that there is a possibility for people to not to go back to a standard American diet. That will never be a luxury that they can afford themselves. It just won't. But for someone to have what?
Luxury. I mean,
Oh, right. I know.
yeah, like
I know.
I did air quotes if you
Right.
can't see me.
The luxury of feeding yourself trash. Yeah.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, it's just not something you're going to be able to do. You may not feel it, but it is causing that permeability, and then other proteins are able to get in and stimulate your immune system, and then we're off to the races. So yeah, but I do, again, we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and I believe that with all of my heart. And I also believe that we are created to live in this world. And this is what I tell my patients, especially when they're looking at me with these forlorn faces, like, oh my gosh, my life is over. You're telling me to do something that I don't know if I can do forever and ever. And what I tell them is, you were created to live in this time and in this space and in this place. And so you were not created for, abject misery. You were created to be resilient. And so our bodies are incredible machines. They really are amazing. Um, and when we feed them right, and when we allow them a measure of health, we are resilient and we are able to tolerate a certain number of, call them indiscretions, call them whatever you want, exposures maybe. We are absolutely resilient and able to handle periodic exposures. So, as in all things, moderation, right?
But
Um,
it's very
yeah.
important that you have that
Oh, up front,
first up front.
without a
However,
doubt.
and what kind of, maybe this is another episode that we should probably get into, if like, okay, you've removed gluten, what are the
Mhm.
things that you should be looking for, as far as what or what signs should you be looking for in terms of, okay, you're starting to heal?
Well, the symptoms of autoimmunity are as diverse as the individual diseases themselves. And so depending on each person what they have going on. So for instance, if someone is hypothyroid due to Hashimoto's, they will experience fatigue, they will experience dry skin, there will be some measure of constipation, could have hair falling out, the list just goes on and on. But they will start to feel better. They will start to feel more energetic. They will start to notice that their hair isn't coming out, that their hair is thicker, that they are growing and keeping hair. They will start to notice that their skin isn't as dry as it has been. They are having bowel movements regularly and daily, where they haven't before. So, yeah, it's just whatever constellation of symptoms accompany someone's autoimmunity, those will start to get better.
On average, and obviously gluten is just one piece of the puzzle. Like,
Exactly.
we're just kind of
Uh-huh.
honing in on that one. There are a
Yeah.
myriad of things like nightshades,
Yeah.
I know, and dairy for some, that have to
Right.
be removed too. But
Right.
gluten is kind of a
hmm Gluten
standard.
gluten opens the door so that the other proteins can get through. It's not the gluten, except for celiac. If someone is a celiac and that is their autoimmune disease, then gluten is the boogeyman, right?
Yeah.
Gluten is the bad guy. It not only causes the intestinal permeability, but then the two protein fractions that gluten breaks down to, it's glutenin and gliadin. So those two protein fractions, they then cross and they are what stimulates the immune system. Okay. But in someone with Hashimoto's, the gluten is just prying open the gut barrier so that other proteins from other foods can get in and wreak havoc. So yeah, the gluten is the absolute bare minimum to take out. It is the first place to start, because it opens the door.
Hmm. So, um, a person is listening and they're saying, okay, I'm going to remove gluten.
hmm
These um, these three-legged stool is showing in my life, and I feel like maybe I
hmm
have some autoimmune. One, first, you need to go see a doctor,
Yeah,
make and get that
yeah.
confirmed, right? But two, if you wanted to go and get started on something, remove gluten
hmm
from
hmm
your diet completely.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then let's talk about some other triggers or things that worsen these
Mm.
flares, and that they can start kind of helping themselves today.
Yes. And so there are some things that cause autoimmunity to flare, that cause it to get worse. Autoimmunity is serious business. It is um, irreversibly often destructive to tissues in the body. And so it is a big deal when it flares. So we want to manage these flares as best we can. Probably, probably I would say the most important thing to control would be stress. And we live in a world, we live in a society that we are just we are balls of stress. Like this is our reality, is that we are stressed constantly.
And
There
we
are
don't even
ways.
know it.
Oh yeah, I mean, people are walking around just like in an absolute clinch, and they have no idea. My husband used to shred napkins under the table when we were out to eat. He had no idea how stressed he was. Yeah, there are people just white knuckling all the time, and that is their general state of being. And so, one thing that I like to encourage people to do, I teach a lot of deep breathing techniques, but I also tell people, hey, there's a lot of different kinds of breathing. It is all helpful. If you can go out and find a deep breathing method that speaks to you, that you can remember and that you can uh, do that. Just pick one and go with it. There are two that I like. 478 breathing is probably my favorite. You guys can Google that. It's super easy. And then you can
Literally do it
also,
anywhere.
yes, anywhere. I encourage people to do it like multiple times a day, especially before eating. And then there's also box breathing that is very helpful as well. So that's two forms of breathing that will help to control stress response. We've also got hormonal changes. So women in particular, we are, oh my gosh, we are like the
Where do we
height.
start?
Oh, yeah, it's just some cosmic joke, the hormones of a woman. We are incredibly complex and we're delightful, but we're very complex. And so, yeah, our hormonal milieu is just this really intricate, complex dance of hormones, and it changes not only month to month, but it also changes throughout the course of our lives. And so, um, periods of hormonal change can also trigger and worsen autoimmunity. States like pregnancy. Pregnancy can, depending on the type of autoimmunity that you have, it can either completely put it into remission, or it can make it flare like crazy. And so, yeah, hormonal states, that is a huge one. Also, and this kind of goes along with stress, but it's a different type of stress, and that is illness. So when you are sick, whether it's an acute illness like you have a cold or you get the flu, or something like cancer, which is like a chronically occurring illness. Um, even, gosh, even a long-term illness like like having stomach ulcers, or whatever illness you can think of, diabetes, that you would have chronically and long term, that also causes your body to stress. And that also can be quite triggering to autoimmunity. And then finally, the last thing is immunosuppressing circumstances and medications. Okay, so um, medications, we're talking things like chemotherapy. Um, Stress causes immunosuppression in the body. So when you are particularly stressed, you secrete lots and lots of cortisol, right? Well, cortisol is the body's own prednisone, if you will. So people know what prednisone is. That's a steroid that we use. Your body creates something very similar called cortisol. And so steroids suppress the immune system. So does cortisol. It works just like if I give you a prescription for a steroid medication, it will suppress your immune system, but so will the stress induced cortisol created by your body. So you're probably hearing a theme here. Control the stress. Yes.
Yes.
It's very, very important to control the stress. And so, sometimes, and I know, Ashley, you run into this too, where you'll have a client that like they've got this terrible job, or they're in some horrific they've got a boyfriend or a significant other that is just like this tumultuous relationship, or they have a friend that is not a good friend and it's causing all kinds of stress and strain. And I think I mentioned, or the job that is just killing them. And sometimes all you can do as their coach, as their trainer, as their provider, all you can do is say, listen, I can only get you so far, but you've got to change your circumstance, because this is literally killing you. And that's a hard conversation to have with somebody. That's really laying it out on the table. But yeah, that's kind of what we're talking about here.
That's awesome. Well, not awesome, but it's good information for people. And it's also the reoccurring theme that I felt like I heard from you was there is hope. Like, when there is a autoimmune present in the body, there are things you can do. You do not have to just band-aid it with medication thrown at you that eventually doesn't work and cut just as far as your story goes, I think weren't you taking like 500 pills a month or something ridiculous?
Probably, yeah. And just, oh, do you hear the dogs?
Yeah.
Oh wow. Boy, they just went crazy.
It's okay.
My house might be broken into right now,
That's
but
okay.
that's all right. They'll take care of it. So yeah, it was more so that they were asking me to go on some chemotherapy
Oh, that's right.
agents, and they were asking me to um, take some drugs that are known hepatotoxicity agents. That means they're very toxic, like irreversibly so, to your liver. Yeah, it was just a terrible, terrible situation. And there are a lot of people with autoimmunity who are in the same boat, where it's like, gosh, well, do you want this disease to cripple you, or do you want to take the drugs, or like what do you want to do? You
Right.
may end up with lymphoma later on as a result of these drugs suppressing your immune system so exquisitely that you can't fight off cancer later on in your life, but at least you'll still be walking for the next few years.
Right.
So yeah, it's a terrible decision to have to make, but there are absolutely things that you can do to help yourself.
Absolutely. And I think in the next episode, let's dive into some of those things more.
Okay.
As far as like, obviously we went into the stress, the hormone changes, the illnesses, the immune suppressing, but like, what are some like steps, or maybe you feel like we've covered that today?
There are a few more things that we could get into. We also are kind of butting up against the individuality of the patient. And so there is this idea of, certainly there is a list of low-hanging fruit that we can all encourage someone to do when they have autoimmunity.
Perfect.
However, beyond that list, we're getting into individual, what do they have going on? What does their medical situation look like? What meds are they on? There's just a myriad of questions, but we can certainly give people, next time, we can give people some concrete solutions. We can expand on some of the things we talked about today, and we can talk about what works and why.
Awesome. And let's not forget too, us, that we will be putting up a question box for some Q&A
awesome.
on our social media. So you can also email us. Our contact information is in the show notes. So if you have some questions, obviously we are not doctors in the sense that we are your doctor, but we are just providing some information that hopefully, one, you feel more confident in, but then two, that you feel more confident in addressing with your doctor too. But So if you have questions that you would like answered on autoimmunity, please submit those to us via either our email or on social media on our question box. But no, this is a great episode. And I think we touched on some, like you said, some low-hanging fruit. And I'm excited next time to dive deeper into that and what that can potentially look like, and give people a place to start. So.
And also, this might be a good time to throw out our Instagram handles so that people can follow us. This is Andrea. I am idahodnp, all one word. And you can find me on Instagram. And speaking of low-hanging fruit, I'm looking at my feed, and it's literally low-hanging fruit.
One of the topics we want to get into soon, especially as winter is coming, is gardening. Andrea has an incredible garden, so go check out her Instagram to see just a glimpse of what she's been growing this past year. It's quite impressive. But and then I am Ashley, and it is Ashley_Olson, and that is OLSON_fitness. But I also put those in the show notes as well for a quick copy paste. So thanks so much for joining, guys, and we will catch you on the next episode.
Bye.
The content provided in the AA podcast is intended for informational and educational purposes only. The podcast is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. The information and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical advice.